how important is Mugabe for what's happening in Zimbabwe? What will happen when he goes? Should we start with you this time?
Okay. Well, perhaps to start off by saying that I think a lot, in terms of answering the question, Robert Mugabe, what happened, if we decide to focus on that particular question, a lot of those answers, I believe, can be found in what Miles said. Was the question of political culture in Zimbabwe is not a question that you can only put on the table in terms of actors outside the stage at this particular point in time. Zimbabwe has got a very specific history, where we're coming from and where authoritarianism basically was at the center of all things political in terms of where we're coming from. If you look at the colonization process, if you look at the struggle for liberation itself, post-independent Zimbabwe, I'm not an expert, but I can be able to tell you that over the course of the last 100 years, people in Zimbabwe have not known another way of doing politics except the way that is being exhibited by Mugabe at this particular point in time. My colleague and fellow workmate Elin Osisulu, in the documentary itself, talks about the parallels or continuities between Ian Smith and Robert Mugabe. And I think when you begin to look at that question a bit more closely, this whole question around culture basically comes to the fore. I'm an avid student of political culture myself, and I believe that well, one of the people that I used to enjoy reading a lot was a person who used to write from Brazil a long time ago, Paulo Freire, who argued that to a very, very large extent, a lot of people, even during the liberation days, who thought they were fighting for freedom, were not necessarily fighting for freedom, but were fighting to become the next oppressors. And unfortunately, Robert Mugabe and what we're experiencing in Zimbabwe is by and large a manifestation of that particular theory. Now, having said that, I think part of what has been placed on the table is how this political culture has impacted ourselves in civil society. And I think it's fair game. I am from civic society. The people that are in the documentary are my colleagues, friends, people that I see on a day-to-day basis. The fact that they themselves are flawed individuals, flawed leaders, and are exhibiting autocratic tendencies that we do not expect to see in any institution that is democratic, does not exonerate Mugabe from what we blame him for and what he himself has done. It doesn't necessarily mean that Dr. Madugu becomes a good person. I think what he has done, I'm not sure to what extent people are familiar with what has been happening where the NCA is concerned, or even President Lavo Matombo himself and the circus that is clearly taking place where the labor movement is concerned in Zimbabwe. These things, I think part of the answer can be found in issues related to political culture. But I'm saying this so that at least, I mean, we can have discussions about that. I'm not saying we should not, but I'm saying at the same time, the frailties and failings of those particular individuals do not turn Robert Mugabe, in spite of his middle name, which is Gabriel, into an angel. And then in terms of the questions that have been placed on the table, the issue of South African influence on the Zimbabwean question, I think that to a very large extent, South Africa has had and continues to have a large say in what happens politically where Zimbabwe is concerned. I think fortunately or unfortunately, our fate is intertwined. Our fates are intertwined as a region, but with greater significance where South Africa is concerned. Because the challenges that Zimbabwe faces, South Africa is amongst the first to feel the brunt. You know, a lot of people would like to run away to the United Kingdom at the first sign of problem.
What do you think after Mugabe? If Mugabe goes, is it going to make a difference?
Well, I don't think Mugabe is innocent. Whatever you might say, Diane. I just pick up some points that you make, Miles. I mean, that political violence in the liberation struggle started, of course, in Zambia with the murder of Chitete. And yeah, you can say that, of course, if you're fighting a revolutionary struggle, and one of the things that I discovered through living through the Zimbabwe situation and was brought face to face with in the making of the film is that there's nothing particularly romantic about revolutions. They're dirty, nasty, violent, messy affairs. And but they're also historically inevitable, I think. I don't think Rhodesia would have changed without Mugabe and Zipra and Nkomo. But not sure that revolutionaries are best qualified to become democrats. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they're not. So there you have a conundrum. How do you break that cycle of violence that MacDonald has referred to? But I do have to say that I think that the political culture that Mugabe has created has been a very corrupting one. And I think the leadership comes from the top. I mean, Zimbabwe was noted in the 80s and 90s of being a place where, unlike other countries in the world, other countries in Africa, the civil servants weren't particularly bribable at the lower level. I mean, if a policeman stopped you, you wouldn't get out of it by bribing the guy. But by the year 2000 onwards, that was the rule, simply because the guys couldn't survive with the kind of level of inflation that was there. So I do hold the man himself accountable for the corruption and, as Eleanor Sisulu suggested, perfection of some of the repressive state apparatus that he inherited from Ian Smith and from the Rhodesians. But then,
what happens afterwards? Let's go back to the question.
Well, that's not perhaps my area of competence. There are people on the panel who are, maybe seers would be able to see the future clearer than I did. I just dealt with the period up until 2009. But I do have to say that in a sense, kind of question Miles, but I don't think it's enough to say that the whole thing is a nasty little mess, therefore we should try and understand the political processes, to abandon rationality, to abandon a kind of narrative. I think that's actually dangerous. I think that's the kind of thing impression that you get from British media, from European media, this idea that dictatorships are somehow inevitable in Africa. And indeed, I think that kind of thing makes the issue very black and white, and that in fact is a very specific political tactic that Robert Mugabe uses. He makes the issues black and white. Anybody who disagrees with Robert Mugabe is a tool of the whites, and therefore you can do whatever you want to them. In the British media, many black leaders are dictators. That kind of inevitability of black and white, they see the issue as a kind of black-white issue between white farmers and black peasants. In fact, it's much more complex than that. And that's what I try to suggest in the film. I try to bring in those dimensions of the IMF, the political pressures of South Africa, some psychological hints as to what it might be like not to be able to attend the funeral of your child, those kind of factors. I wanted to bring a kind of bit more complexity around that reading of history. But as to the future,
so I know we have some other questions, but just to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, would you say then that in the first, actually, is it half of the film or is it over? It felt to me like over half of the film where you're building up a positive picture of Mugabe. That part of that is actually an attempt to undermine that black-white narrative,
yeah,
which is used by both sides, whatever the sides are, but used by Mugabe and by Mugabe's opponents, the black-white narrative. So you actually, was it a conscious attempt to intervene in that narrative?
Well, yeah, I mean, I come from a white activist family. So in the 60s, my parents were demonstrating against Ian Smith. So yeah, I'm not happy with a kind of a black-white narrative.
And I don't mean black-white as in melanin, I mean...
But I mean, the black-white is melanin and also a kind of a yes-no scenario. I mean, the kind of metaphor carries on from colour through to political analysis. So, yes, it was a very